So as we move forward in our study of Joseph, we know that the story of Joseph, of course, is in Genesis, beginning as far as the account of Joseph and his personal life, beginning in Genesis 37 and moving toward all the way to the end, where Joseph dies at the very end of Genesis. So it is a story or an account from the Old Testament. Sometimes those accounts become convoluted in a sense. Sometimes people steer away from them, steer away from investigating them a little, because, after all, it's in the Old Testament. But the Old Testament is just as relevant to us today as the New. They are both profitable, as 2 Timothy 3:16 says, that all Scripture is inspired by God, and it is profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, for training in righteousness. I won't get into right now how important doctrine is, and reproof and correction and training and living righteous. We won't go there yet. But just to look at specifically, Paul tells us that all Scripture is profitable. Of course, the Scripture that they had in Paul's day was the Old Testament. The New Testament had not been processed. It was in the process of being written, but it had not been compiled. And so they had the scrolls from the Old Testament, the law, but they did not have the writings of Paul, obviously, except for the ones that he sent directly to the churches, because those had not been actually put in the Scripture per se. But it's important to see that when we look at the Old Testament, it contains the past, it contains the present, and the future. And when we look at the New Testament, it contains the past, the present, and the future. I had a couple ideas as to how to present this, and one of the ideas that I had is to take a look at this logo. Everybody knows what FedEx is, of course, but I was interested to see the FedEx logo in the way that I see it now, because I had never seen this before until I started doing some investigation. I learned that the FedEx logo has received many awards, many accolades for its ingenuity and for the genius of its creator, of its designer. And I want to take just a minute and show you why. If you look at it, you may see now, if I say that there's something in it, you may already be aware. But if you look at it and you haven't been aware, if you look at it now and I say there's something in this particular logo that you may not have ever seen before, you may look at it again and you might be able to find it. If you can't, then I'm going to help you and show you that there is an arrow between the E and the X, and that is intentional. The designer of the logo designed in the logo part of the FedEx mission, and that is to deliver packages quickly, efficiently, and from the one point to the other as quickly and efficiently as possible. So now when you look at the FedEx logo without the added highlighted arrow, you can see between the E and the X there's an arrow, because I've explained to you the way the designer was thinking. I'm explaining to you his thoughts as he designed this logo. And so my point is that when you understand the thought of the designer, when you understand the thought of the creator of the logo, or in this case, we're understanding the mind of the creator of the world when we study Scripture, you can see that you have to interpret it not just based on what you see at the surface, though that certainly tells you that FedEx delivered it, or that you're going to a FedEx office, or that it's a FedEx truck. But if you look really closely, and if you peel back another layer, and you know the intention of the designer of the logo, then you can see that he put inside the logo, he embedded the mission of the company. And so it's quite ingenious. And in the same kind of way, Creator God has put in His Word especially in the Old Testament, is put in there, not a code that people go crazy with trying to add numbers and letters and whatever they do to try to determine the end of the world. Not that kind of code, but a code in a sense, just like the code in the logo of FedEx, to show a purpose, to show a reason, and to point toward something else. You may have seen something like this before. If I show you a picture like this, for example, you may look at it and see just lines. But if you look a little closer, then you'll actually see a word. I've seen this pretty much my whole life. And so now when I look at it, I can see that it says Jesus. This is kind of the way that Jesus is approached and how he is shown in the Old Testament. Jesus is all the way through Scripture. He is God. He is his Word. John 1 tells us that. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us in the form of Christ. So God is his Word. So therefore everything in the Scripture points to him. It points to Jesus. It points to the cross of Christ, the resurrection of Christ, the birth of Christ, the ascension of Christ, and not only that, but his second coming. Everything points to Jesus. And when you begin to look at the Old Testament in this way, you can see how people would have come to understand Christ as the Messiah. In fact, a misinterpretation of Scripture and a misrepresentation of the Old Testament led many people not to receive him, even his own followers, such as Cleopas on the road to Emmaus, for example. When he saw the resurrected Christ, he was shocked because he didn't understand the Scripture. But Jesus talked to him about it and revealed to him himself in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, you see Jesus, and you see him very clearly. There's no question. He's the name above every name. And his nature, his character, who he is and what he came to do is very clear and very evident. And the Old Testament is very clear and very evident. But you have to know how to look at it. So the Old and New Testament are connected. It is not a divided book like we divide it. But it's all a continuum. From the very beginning to the very end, everything in the Scripture reveals something to us about Christ.